It's great to be here and have these kinds of discussions, which we hardly ever get to have, and to dig a little deeper below the surface in some of the issues that we're currently facing. So we are the last panel of the day, and I will just quickly introduce them and do a brief overview. So we have Christopher Smith from Alberta, we have Pamela Upal from Ontario, Karen LaFlèche from Manitoba, and Eva Lloyd from England, and who all come with a different perspective and a different role in nonprofit sectors. So, Gordon, I should have looked at your slides before I started my presentation, because I did the flip of what the supply is like, but in the nonprofit sector. And the point is, there's much less nonprofit childcare in full day 0 to 5 spaces than in the overall. So I won't even really comment on this because I think Gord did a great job of setting that picture. But in 8 of the 13 jurisdictions, well over half of the 0 to 5 full day childcare is currently in the for-profit sector. So I'd like to touch on a couple of things that Michelle said this morning. So as everybody knows, the Canadawide Early Learning and Childcare Agreements were initiated by the federal government, the $30 billion that was put into childcare. But it is the provinces and territories that have overall responsibility for childcare. And so the conditions that are put on how that money is spent is pretty limited. So I'm being really upset to hear lately all the negative press on how this is a failure, as Michelle mentioned this morning, and that's all falling on the federal government, when in fact a lot of this falls to the provinces and territories and their lack of action or where they're choosing to invest their money. And some provinces are gung-ho and moving forward, and a couple, let's say at least, one might even argue that they're working against the goals of this program. And they do have a variety of approaches to how they're spending their money and how they're proposing to expand. I'd like to make the point that the nonprofit sector, it's not a homogeneous entity. There are many types of nonprofit programs. So from years and years ago, when I was a parent in nonprofit childcare a long time ago, it was largely standalone individual parent boards. Parents are the employers, they have all the responsibility, and depending on whether they're strong or weak and the role of the director, it can be stable or not so stable. There are still a lot of standalone individual nonprofit centers. There are also an increasing number of multi-site operations where childcare is still the business of the nonprofit, but they have many centers or a number of centers. And then we have multi-service organizations that operate childcare, but also other family-related services as well. And then the charitable versus nonprofit, which Chris is going to talk about in a minute, with different legal they're different legal entities, and they have different accountability requirements. And then we have some gray areas where they may or may not be nonprofit or for-profit, such as co-ops, social enterprises, and the participation of some for-profit entities in nonprofit provision, just as Aisling mentioned in the last panel about this, large for-profit that became a charitable organization. And we're seeing a fair amount of that kind of thing happening in BC right now. So just some things to think about as we listen to the panel to inform some of our discussion tomorrow are some forms of nonprofit preferable to others? Is the small standalone still a viable option? Is it much more beneficial to have a larger entity? Unlike just about any other service, there's no there's no infrastructure to deliver childcare. We don't have, school for nonprofit childcare. There's nothing like a school board. There's nothing like outside of Ontario, like a formal municipal structure, and we don't have like health authorities that operate childcare. So quite often it's the provincial government and then a whole bunch of operators, which does create challenges. So does the nonprofit sector have the capacity, is a big issue, we keep hearing, to actually deliver on these very ambitious expansion targets? And if so, or if not, what supports do they need? What do they need to have in place to be successful? Another question is, how do nonprofits fit into the planning program, into the planning process? Typically, it's been either government will put out an RFP for capital funding or for, anybody can pop up wherever they want. But does that create equitable childcare? No. There are many places, childcare deserts, where there is either not the capacity to form a new board or there is no existing organization there to operate. So who initiates the establishment of new programs, and what's the role of government in that? And how do nonprofits access capital funding, and who should own a publicly funded facility? We've already had a fair bit of discussion about that. And where does and should nonprofit provision fit into the mix of a universal system? And this is maybe off topic of nonprofit, but I just feel compelled to make a comment about this when we were hearing about, the lax regulatory environment. So we're focused on affordability being done quite well. Now we're focusing on expansion. And typically when we talk about quality, we're focusing on the workforce because they are the main provider of quality care, but we're not really talking about principles. Do we have a set of principles to guide what we're doing? Where does the best interest of children fit into the mix? And we're not talking about our current regulations, which are completely driven by a market approach. They're prescriptive rather than enabling, like with school legislation or, other forms of public provision. And so when you have such prescriptive regulations, you can't ask for more than that. So you can't deny a for-profit operator, you can't do this, because if they're meeting those little, prescriptive regulations, like we regulate childcare kind of like a restaurant, that, the floor below which you're going to harm children. So those are some things I think we should think about as we look about, building the system and expanding the nonprofit sector. So.